Hey everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. Last episode, we took a deep dive into what entertainment is, but we were immediately aware post-recording that we needed to expound further on the topic. While good groundwork was laid, a true discussion of entertainment in modernity must cover some essential points related to how media affects us, the individuals, the entertainers, and society. Today we'll build on the overview we established last time and focus on the role of entertainment consumption in the modern world.
That's a very nice formal. There, we did that.
Yeah.
But we promised not to lecture.
Yeah. So it was a great episode. It was a long episode. It was in depth. I think that we covered a lot of very important things. But we still got to the end of it and I go, you know what? It didn't get into the details of, how I think a lot of the questions that we have about entertainment today, it was a good historical overview, a good overview, philosophical overview, but it didn't really, it didn't really touch on the important topics and questions that I think people might have.
Yeah.
So today, we're going to build off the things that we talked about yesterday to get into those details a little bit more. So we will start with a little bit of overview and a little bit of history, but from a different angle, right? So what is the history of entertainment critiquing? How, we've talked about entertainment last week, what it is, how people, had discussed it, but when did people start sort of reflecting on it that it was something more than just, like we were saying yesterday, sensationalism or perceptual based. It was something that deserved to be reflected on.
Well, I'm going to exhibit a bias because I remember taking a class in which this became a major. The idea of media theory is in the forefront of that class and led me to do lots of reading, but also put me in the mindset that in all seriousness, talking about media has gone on from an ethical viewpoint back to Aristotle, but mostly from a moralistic, everything should be in moderation. Don't play too much, don't eat too much, kind of thing. And then, of course, criticisms of books once the printing press, once it became common for people to have, then more critiques of what people were writing. And then the component of politics as entertainment started spinning up when we as a human species started being able to criticize governments, and that's been a long time.
Yeah.
But from a really intensive viewpoint, I would say that in the 20th century. And
I think that's what I was sort of finding in a lot of my research. Like Max Horkheimer talking about, critiquing the cultural industry, right? The dialectic of enlightenment. So around World War II.
Yeah. And then Marshall McLuhan.
And what they were talking about was kind of what we touched on last week. And that's the relationship between art and entertainment, right? And that's something that we didn't, we talked about some, but we didn't get too deep into the weeds on. I don't know that we will today, but this idea of where do you draw the line between art and entertainment, or what is the overlap and what are the implications for the distinction between the two, and how does commodifying art, register with what entertainment is, so.
Yeah.
So a lot of 21st,
20 and 21st century.
Yeah. Like you said, I think if we go back to the Nicomachean ethics and things, there's definitely a critiquing of entertainment, but it's more so, like you were saying, it's this sort of general and moral responsibility of the individual, as opposed to kind of a breakdown of what it is that is being created or presented and how that impacts the individual in society.
Yeah. It was for theoretical approaches or deep analysis or creating paradigms to understand, to try to see that entertainment is not just something that we do or that we take in to veg out or relax, as we talked about last time, but it changes us, it affects us, it changes how we view things, even if we don't realize until we start thinking about it that it has done that. And that's when McLuhan and Neil Postman come in.
Yeah, or Pierre Bourdieu.
Yeah,
talking about sort of the judgment of taste, right, and how popularity and quality aren't necessarily
synonymous.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is, if you think about it, that's kind of the foundation of art and entertainment critiquing, right? Is this idea that, like we were talking about last week, my big beef with Hume on that was that's kind of what Hume thought, right? He said, well, hey, if you have a bunch of experts and they agree on something, then it's probably good. And I go, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know about that.
No. I remember doing an honors project with one of my students, Preston. He wanted to pursue aesthetics. And so we took a semester to talk about aesthetics and the groundwork that was laid by so many philosophers and the formality of it and the Humean and others approach to it, saying, well, when you have refined your tastes, then you will see that this is good, which in one sense is like saying, someday you'll grow up and like broccoli. But and I'm not suggesting that art is broccoli. But of course there is a development. I mean, I can't say at 66 that I see things the same way as a piece that I first encountered, but I know it's something that might have taken my breath away. And it might have been a Jack Kirby drawing in a comic book, or seeing Renaissance art, because that did it. But I didn't know what I was seeing. And so I think to the extent that a philosopher, critic, aesthetician can talk with us and say, well, what are you noticing? And what do you make of that? And then the historical, here's what the painter was doing. And then maybe there's also biographical, historical material, notes, journals, whatever it happens to be, where an artist will be talking about something like that. But ultimately, you can develop a sense. Like we were talking about a painting that you've done, and you and I, we do art, and Amanda, and you use the term sfumato. Sfumato is a technique. It's a technique of blending with contrastive elements, and that's not a word I knew. My art teacher may have tried to teach me that when I was 17, but I don't remember it from there. But my art teacher now taught it to me, and it's still, it's in my head forever. But you don't need to know the term sfumato to appreciate that there's something going on between two different kinds of clouds, and it gives depth and effect of haziness and so on. But it helps to have a term, because then you can say, all right, I want to try this on something else. I can hang my hat on that hanger, so to speak, and say, I recognize this. Now I can study sfumato. Now I can, if I want, and see how many different ways it's been done. I think that's where the formality is useful. Not to tell people, you must appreciate this, or you're a plebeian. You must appreciate this, or you're a barbarian, or it's, that class nonsense. But if you do make the attempt to understand this, you might see more.
Yeah.
In the next thing you encounter. And so that, back to the entertainment versus art, or high and low, those spatial metaphors, I think that's really the best intent when we go to learning more about what we think we're seeing.
Yeah. And I think that covered pretty well, the relevance and the legitimacy of critiquing art and entertainment, which is something that is a very tricky subject, right? And we've seen philosophers throughout history present highly contrasting positions, and some of them which appear to not hold much water. This is something I've thought about myself quite a bit. I even started, writing a book about it a few years ago, and I might pick it up at some point, trying to determine, if a lot of art is subjective, it's in the eye of the beholder, where is there room for determining how you establish quality and how quality interacts with popularity and those sorts of things. So, has entertainment always been regarded as potentially dangerous?
Off and on. I won't say always is in a steady state, but certainly whenever a culture, Shakespeare, at times Elizabethan and pre-Elizabethan, the theater became an explosive place. This is one example. When you have Christian moralism or choose your religion moralism going on, there's often an attempt to squelch, to deny, to censor, to squeeze arts because they feel radical and dangerous and outre, and in fact they are, because the arts, when they have full reign, the arts unleashed, Prometheus unchained, will tell you things that you don't necessarily want to hear. Well, that doesn't necessarily change you, but if you're afraid to hear them in the first place, or afraid to see them in the first place, that indicates a fragility of mind and spirit that the arts are counter to. And so if you feel that a play can cause a whole culture to collapse, then you don't have much faith in the culture, or really an understanding of your own humanity. I'm pretty strident about these things. And so, yes, it does bubble up. It happens. No, we're not supposed to, we're encountering it in our own culture now. But as a more recent historical example, the Soviet Union, where art and in the Third Reich, art is for propaganda only. And the only kind of propaganda is the right propaganda. The right propaganda is only about who's in power and what their story should be. And anything else is seen as a threat and a challenge. Art is often, periodically throughout history, cast as a villain because it wants to take down order and peace, and sometimes art does.
It's sort of its job in some ways, isn't it? I know there's been a lot of armchair philosophizing, but also some research into comedy, right? Why do people find things funny? What is the formula for comedic effect? And what they found is in a lot of cases, it's boundary pushing, right? Trying to discover that uncertain edge of what's socially acceptable. And I mean, it has the effect of sort of emotionally doing what I did physically this week, which was riding roller coasters, right? It gives you that little bit of flutter in your belly when you go, oh, this is kind of on the edge.
We're being naughty.
Yeah.
We're breaking a rule.
Yeah. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that as an intrinsic part of art, and maybe even more so entertainment, right? And I think that where the danger aspect comes in, right, is this idea of entertainment shaping social identities through narratives and role models, right?
Mediated communication, which is what entertainment is.
And so I think that your views on human nature sort of determine whether or not you view this as dangerous, right? Because like you were saying, I'm also pretty strident about it. Like I'm against book banning of any kind, right? I'm against it because in my mind, right, you can see kind of like the examples that you just laid out with the Soviet Union and the Third Reich and that sort of thing.
McCarthyism.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Controlling art, controlling entertainment, controlling the mediums through which people can interact and think, and the things that sort of shape social identity can cause people to filter into, you can shape society in a certain way.
Yeah.
Whereas if things are left open, right, this is, the creative space and people are allowed to enjoy it. I think what's going to happen is you're going to have a highly diverse, number of views and opinions and aspects, and those are going to sort of communicate, and out of them are going to come new things and useful things and things that
Yes.
reach into a higher level.
The baseline is really this. Since we're both strident together, if you don't want to read it, don't. If you don't want to watch it, don't. But it goes deeper than that, because that would be simple enough. When you get in the position of saying, well, I'll be the policeman because I know what's right and wrong, and therefore I will only allow you to have these choices. That's when it gets out of hand. That's when it becomes truly dangerous, because it becomes reductive and ideological in its real sense, which is to tell people they can't think anything else.
Yeah. And I mean, so, that's where the views of the danger come in, right? If you have a more conservative lean, then you're going to think that exposure to these things that are on the fringe of society are dangerous to the moral identity of the individuals and of society. And if you have a more liberal bend, you're going to think that the control of freedom of thought and expression are going to lead to a more dangerous bend in society. I think that the thing is, if you look at history, right, you tend to see that one of those is more exonerated than the other, right? Control does lead to sort of totalitarian things where large members of society are complicit in acts that they may not otherwise have been. Whereas if you look at sort of more free-thinking societies and more expansive societies, they tend to be more open and expressive and progressive. And
that's right. And this is where, well, for instance, you mentioned others, Horkheimer and Baudreau, but this is where Marshall McLuhan comes in and says, you know what? Everybody's focusing on the message, what they think a particular medium is saying. But his quintessentially most recognized line is the medium is the message. And what he would, in the 60s was starting to, 50s and 60s was working on as a young Canadian professor, and he's worked in the United States and back to Canada, but is that it's not the message, it's the medium itself that shapes it. And if we can try to understand what the medium itself is doing and how it is shaping the way we're thinking, then we get to the root of it. Then we if not controlling it, at least can recognize what's going on. That led for a long time. I know it still happens in schools. I think it's an act of futility really at this point, because either it's been learned or it hasn't. But I remember as a teenager in high school, a few teachers picking up on the McLuhan stuff, and we'd have exercises about watching an advertisement and trying to understand how that advertisement is really trying to sell us something. Well, yes. So you understood the message, and maybe you understood the mechanism maybe behind it, but you still weren't getting the fact that everybody's watching television. And so we can say, oh, we're not affected by that. Oh, when I have a streaming service, I pay more so I don't have to have ads. Then you just have to do that either. But now you just, or I deal with the ads, but I just mute them. Nonetheless, muted or not, you're still watching. Or if you're not watching and you walk away, then you're removing your experience, but it's still affecting you because it interrupted a narrative you were watching or something. You walked away from it. That means how you are taking the medium itself has changed your way of thinking.
Yeah, there's kind of two things going on here, right? There's the medium, and then there's sort of the message in some ways, right? The idea of symbols shaping social realities, George Herbert Mead. So there's, and I think that's the deep psychological part, right? If you, my psychology path is taking me into different and in my mind more interesting things. But, industrial organizational psychology, looking at marketing and advertisement and things, and like, okay, how can the symbols of this influence the way that a consumer thinks. But you're right, it does. What we fail to recognize is that those things are all just paint on a canvas, and the canvas is the medium itself, the things that's underlying it. And I think that that's sort of been brought to light in the 21st century with smartphones, right? I think that there had been less attention paid to the medium itself all the way up until 2011, 2013, when all of a sudden we had these handheld computers, and people go, well, how is the blue light affecting us? How is the instant access to all of the information in the world affecting us? And then the studies started to come in, and we found that it's fundamentally shaping our brain in different ways. So just the medium itself, has its own effects. And then on top of it, there's all of the layered symbolism that goes along with it.
And we say things like, with ironic humor sometimes, or wry, or we're just so cool that we know this, but it's rewiring our brains. And we say that, well, it's rewiring our brains. What are we doing? And I'm sitting here with a phone with notes on it. I mean, and we're talking in a studio. We've talked in your kitchen, but we're mediated by all kinds of things. You thought about the sound quality. The lists are virtually endless. But to just write it off and say, yes, well, it's rewriting our brains. And that's okay. Because we're going to go on. Why? Because we like the medium. And then people will complain about the medium, but not a lot of people put it down.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's hard for anybody to put it down permanently into, today. So what is the role of escapism in entertainment?
Well, not to be tautological, but I think it's really built into the name. I want to get away from it all. I want to get away from some of it all. I want to shut some of things out. I want to compartmentalize and say, this terrible stuff isn't happening. I know it's happening. But right now, I need to see familiar characters reenact a story that I already know, because somehow it's going to hearten me. There's Avengers for me. Or I want to watch these actors do something because I like to watch them. Or this sounds like an interesting story. I'm going to sit around the blue fire, the digitization of flame, and I'm going to have these stories told to me. And I might forget where I am for a moment, and I might relax. I might find that I've been refreshed because I haven't been in the loop of the news or something like that. And so escapism, to me, it's a really strange concept, because we escape to something. What do we escape to? These people are having life and death situations. Somebody's trying to track them down and blast them away. A planet's going to blow up unless we change. It's like, okay, but it's controlled. We suspend belief, but we know it's not happening, and yet we don't want somebody busting into that story in the middle of it. I remember my grandparents, who, for television, for them was something else, because they had radio, and before that, nothing. And so they didn't mind at all sitting, when I was trying to escape as a kid, sitting and talking over the television. Or you're just starting to watch something, and then they ask you a question about school, and you're saying, dang it. And you can't tell your grandparents to be quiet.
Right.
I'm watching something, because that wouldn't have worked. Then you wouldn't have been watching it at all. It would have been taken away. But that's the intrusive part. You're escaping if you don't want somebody busting into it.
Right. Yeah. And so it's interesting, right? It's the same thing that I was talking about with comedy before, right? If we what are we escaping to? Because like you said, a lot of the things that we consider entertaining are sort of nightmarish scenarios, right? Well, what is a roller coaster, right? Other than a physical nightmare.
You're throwing yourself through space.
Like, I want to feel like I'm free falling through space, like I'm about to die. That's my idea of a good time. It's the same thing, but just psychologically with a lot of the entertainment that we consume on a regular basis, right? TV and movies and these sorts of things.
Yeah.
We're escaping to this place where we're looking at what would be happening on the fringe of acceptable society, right? In terms of wars and other plot lines. And I think that in that way, it's almost serving as a type of lucid dream, right? It's this sort of like prediction machine. Like, what would happen in this extremely, out there scenario? How would this play out?
How do detectives take their, what's the method that they use?
Right, because our brains are highly habituated, right? So we go through our everyday lives and we see the things that are mundane, and we don't necessarily want our regular lives to be different, right? We want them to be predictable. We want them to be safe, but the brain starts to just get lulled into this, you know what, this is just the way that it is, and I'm kind of bored. Like, what would happen if something crazy happened, right? And there might even be an evolutionarily adaptive notion to that, right? Okay, well, I'm safe now, but in the future, I might not be safe. What kind of dangers might I face, and how would I deal with them? And dreaming and entertainment and these sorts of things sort of provide us that kind of escapism.
And it boosts our ego sometimes. I mean, sometimes we can just be flat out, but there's a recent film, for instance. I haven't watched any of these, but I've heard people talk about it. Quiet Place, an alien invasion film. I guess the newest one that's out is a prequel because it's telling you how what actually happened. You can't make a noise or the aliens get you, but if you're really, really quiet, they don't. And so, you could go into a film like that, and I've heard people talking about this and think, oh, no, that was a mistake. You wouldn't do that. You'd be really, really quiet. I'm thinking, nope, I get gobbled up into silence because I'm going to trip on something or I'm going to bump something, and then it's all done. But we don't believe that about ourselves when we're going in and watching. We're saying, God, I'd be as sharp as Tony Stark if I had that kind of money. No, probably not.
Right.
And I don't want to be as arrogant as he is anyway. But we start to compare, contrast, even as we're being entertained. Who's the one we'd really, in a hero story, which costume do we really want to wear and make ourselves think we'd look good in there? Or the entertainment can be from ironic, sophisticated view kind of thing. And you're sitting in the movie theater watching, my son and I talked about this because we're watching the latest Indiana Jones movie, which is pure popcorn escapism, right? But there's still a line in escapism where take me away, but don't make this so ridiculous that I can't be part of it. And so we're watching, and the things that happen in the first few minutes, he's saying, nope, he's dead. No, he's dead. So somehow, unlike the Uncanny Valley or something adjacent to it, there's a point at which escapism becomes so fantastical that you just start laughing.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Laughter is great, but that's not what the purpose was.
Right. Yeah. No, Amanda and I have discussed this several times. What's the difference between being cheesy and campy, right? Or corny and campy, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of that line, right? Between something that is enjoyable and out there, but believable versus something that is
Hallmark Christmas movies.
right? Yeah. Something that is not believable, but something interesting happens at that point, right? If it's not believable, it can still be enjoyable to some people, but for some people that will immediately drop them out of it. And then I think that sort of depends on your relationship with escapism, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so this idea,
one size fits all.
Yeah, this idea of escapism. I mean, this is Neil Postman, right? This is what you were kind of talking about after last week's episode wrapped up.
Yeah.
This idea of balancing relaxation with potential disengagement from reality, right? And I think it's another area where the danger of entertainment can be viewed a couple different ways, and I think that just that term in general, escaping, right, is kind of then you're sort of viewing your regular reality as a prison, right?
Exactly. Or we can do this here in the movies or in the novels or whatever we're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
We can look at this because it's on a wall in a museum, whatever. McLuhan, one of the many things he said that Postman picked up on, every society honors its live conformists and its dead troublemakers.
Yeah.
And we're living that now, right? And in some sense, nobody in the world should. There's protests. We don't protests. Protests are off-putting in the United States. So many people don't want to hear protests because that's trouble. Right here in River City, that's the Music Man. It's itchy. It's the blue comedy. It's the stuff we go to comedy because the comedians are saying stuff we don't feel like we necessarily can say ourselves, or they're saying it better. They're the court jester, poking at the king. It's so necessary, but it can be deflationary too. One of the dangers of the media, the entertainment, is that if it takes away your energy to actually do something when you think something needs to be done, then it can be a drug.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this is, we can revisit, you and I were just talking about him before the show, John Paul Sartre, right? We've done a whole episode on him, arguing for confronting reality in order to achieve authenticity, right? In being in nothingness. So this is sort of a counterpoint to the escapism, or rather a contextualization to the escapism, right? So this idea that, sure, you need to escape from time to time because your brain gets kind of bored with everyday life, and it's good to sort of stretch those creative muscles by going to places that you haven't been, or you don't normally go, or that make you uncomfortable, and starting to view things from a different perspective and learn some different lessons. But if you become so immersed in it that, like you mentioned, you're sort of using it now instead of escaping from reality as a way of sort of bettering yourself in some ways, right? In terms of, like I was just mentioning, all of those positive things of stretching your creativity. If instead you're using it to get away from your actual life, then Sartre says, then you're living an inauthentic life.
Yes. And it's because you because there's an umbilicus directly from Sartre in some ways to Neil Postman, who a lot of people listening to us when I say this next thing are going to say, yeah, another one of those old guys, because Neil Postman was the media theorist for some time in the 80s and in the 90s, but his work is coming back, and it's because of its continued relevance in a critical sense to what we're doing. His probably arguably his most famous book, and the one that I first encountered in reading, was called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And if you just take that line, entertaining ourselves, because entertainment is amusement. We have amusement parks. Oh, but then bad things happen at amusement parks sometimes. Well, that's not going to happen to me statistically. Okay, no, but you could be one of those people that ends up hanging upside down for 12 hours, or maybe it's not that long, but when the machine stops. And he was talking about lots of important things, but among them, akin to what you just mentioned, and with Sartre, we can become inauthentic in that we can become lifeless if we let all the entertainment do its thing for us, so to speak. I'm living through that, but then James Thurber was a humorist, a humorist in the first half of the 20th century. And have you ever encountered him?
I don't think so.
And he was one of those people who was had the character named Walter Mitty, for instance.
Okay. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Who's always living these grand fantasies, but his life is just as gray as it could possibly be. And there's nothing wrong with living a fantasy, as long as your gray life, it's not just that, oh, well, I'm conforming and it's fine. It's that, okay, you embrace your gray life. Okay, but a lot of people don't. And they could make something more, but the entertainment is doing it for them.
Yeah, I think this is the crux of the whole issue. that we didn't get to last week that we wanted to talk to this week, right? Entertainment consumption, right? And how you strike that balance that Postman was talking about. And I think that, the message isn't that, you watch, this action movie and now you should go out and be Indiana Jones, right? That's not the message you want to take away. Not everybody can be Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones in real life isn't going to play out the way it plays out on the screen, right? So what is the message? What is the message of entertainment, right? I think it's an approach to your everyday life, right? It's a way of taking charge of certain situations. It's in informing you how to be the hero in your own story, right? And even if though most of the time your adventures are conversations, right? Or are different patterns of activity, things that you might pursue or that sort of thing. Those are the situations in which you go, you know what, maybe I am going to reach out and try to volunteer in some way, right? Or maybe I am going to try this new activity and even if I'm not good at it, or even if, people are going to see me and I might be embarrassed, maybe it's something that's worth doing. Or, maybe I'm actually going to sort of stand up for myself and say what I actually think about this situation rather than just being quiet, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that the real danger of entertainment is what you've been saying, right? Where if you're spending so much time escaping, that you sort of have that need met rather than drawing the lessons from it in order to approach your everyday life. If you go, okay, well, now I have to go into my everyday life. I have to confront reality. And, I'm just going to lay low for my 8 hours a day at work. And then I'm going to come home and then I'm going to escape.
Yep.
And that's what I'm looking forward to. And then when it's done, I'm not taking anything from it with me, right? I haven't been informed or learned or grown in any ways. It was merely a period in time in which I could escape authentic reality. And now I'm just back into a slog in which I'm not living authentically, right?
Yeah, you said that well. And I think about, we'll take just a momentary side because it's totally relevant to this, amusing ourselves to death. What do you think of the word amusement? When you hear amusement, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I think, amusement, that normally comes along with comedy. I feel like there's a much more, voyeuristic element to amusement than there is to entertainment as a whole. It seems more observational in some ways.
And it came etymologically from the French in the 1600s. It was a military tactic to divert attention. That's amusement.
Huh.
And you know that stuff very well from your previous life. But isn't that interesting?
That is interesting.
So amusement is diverting attention because to be amused means the muse. If you can go back to the Greek material with this, so a muse is something that inspires you. If you are mused, you can be bemused, and to be bemused is to be sort of knocked sideways and so taken with something you're missing what else is going around you. So it's a distraction. And if you're constantly distracted, what are you going to accomplish? See, I think there's a strange convoluted path with this etymologically, but also practically in culture, so that we had a term for it for a while, and then we made fun of that. We were amused by the term, right? First, people were claiming they could multitask. Well, as you know in your own studies, you can't. We don't multitask well. Anybody who tells you they multitask well is lying to themselves, because you can do more than one thing within a certain frame of time. But the more you are distracted onto those different things, the less time you're given to any one of them. Sure, you can sit and write a memo, answer a phone call, go back to the memo. Oh, wait a minute. There's an altercation going on in the office. I got to check and see what that is. If somebody needs help, come back to the memo. But you don't just come back to the memo. I'm talking about mundane things here, right? Parenting. People, the greatest multitaskers on earth, except, yes, but it's not not an efficient or always healthy process. And so now we go back to this and think about how media, and we're constantly talking about the idea of what media does to us, and what social media does, what people who are living more and more of their lives, and it's not just Facebook, or as old people say, the Facebook. It's Betty White did that. It was a wonderful thing on a long time ago. Marvelous comedian. But whatever you call it, whatever the current thing is, because young people, of course, because that's what young people do. If old people have cottoned onto it, old people are messing around with Facebook. You notice that a lot of young people disappeared out of Facebook. That's not where that's not where they're causing each other difficulty. And some are not causing difficulty, but some are bullying people or hurting people, or other people are trying to mislead them. But it's not all bad. Just because that stuff is happening doesn't mean it's a uniformly bad place. It's more complicated than that. But we don't know that until we stop being distracted and start thinking about what it is that we're doing. And I think there are a number of people who are starting to do this. Mm-hmm. They call it unplugging, call it what you will. But just unplugging means an all or nothing approach that sacrifices the possibilities and the tangible utility and goodness that can be had by using these tools.
Yeah. Bringing amusement into the mix really creates a complex sort of scenario for this, right? When we start thinking about art, entertainment, and amusement, right? Because like I mentioned, last week I went to an amusement park, right? Rode roller coasters, and you go, yeah, there's really no practical element to this, right? It's all sensual, perceptual, right? Mm-hmm. It's this feeling of danger, right? But that's not, well, and I shouldn't say that, right? That's not the way I engage with art or entertainment all the time.
No.
And I think we talked about a little bit last week, right? If I'm listening to music, I sort of have two different modes, right? Usually the first time I listen to a song, all I'm listening to is the emotion of the piece, right? I want to be amused or entertained by it. But on the next few listens, right? Yep. Now I'm evaluating it as a piece of art, right? Now I'm looking at what each instrument is doing and how things are fitting together and trying to peek behind the curtain to see how this thing is constructed, right? And I do this with movies and television and paintings and all kinds of things, right? So I like to what you're saying. I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with being amused or entertained, but like we've sort of been mentioning, it really shouldn't end there, right? But I think that the fear with some people, and I think that this is what happens with professional artists, right? With people who make music or who paint or who create television and movies, is that once you go beyond the amusement or the entertainment and you start engaging in the artistic process, the technical artistic process, it's hard to go backwards, right? And I think that that's where some stilted, formulaic things start to come from artists who previously had been very inspired, right, by the muse, right? You lose that emotional, inspirational connection to the thing that you have created. And now you're so caught up in the technical and in the things that you think make good art or good entertainment, that they lose the entertainment or amusement value. Indeed. That is an inherent and good part of art and entertainment. You do need it to be amusing, right? Amusement is not a non-negotiable part of entertainment or art. It is an essential component. But you have to go beyond it in order to have something that is useful. So,
yes, well said.
So what are the ethical considerations of entertainment consumption?
Well, McLuhan went into this with a thing. Did you encounter this? It's called the tetrad.
Yeah.
So he has a visualization of this. Tetrad is a 4-point item, but he said that it all works together. So you take any particular medium ask me the question again, Joel, because I don't want to get off track. But
ethical considerations.
Right. So how do you determine what that medium is doing, whether it's good or bad, useful or frivolous, or whatever terms, moralistic or ethical terms you want to put to it? And he said, we have to think about 4 things at once. There's multitasking again, or rather 4 things in process, not in a linear or chronological way. How it enhances or detracts. What does the medium reverse or advance? What does the medium make obsolete? Or how does obsolescence happen, and what does that do to the ethical positions of whatever's being done with the medium, and what it retrieves? So here's one example that I think maybe will catch this. People now, because of the profusion of changes in so many kinds of technology, some of us used to take videotapes of our kids. All right. And the videotape, there are still videotape players. But then videotapes became smaller and more compressed. And there aren't just immediately available at hand to everyone ways to play those videos on that later compressed form. The same was true with computers. We went from floppy disks. Try to find a floppy disk. I mean, go on eBay and get one, but try to retrieve something off a floppy disk and put it onto the screen now. It's not a simple process. So that's what is the obsolescence caused us to lose. And usually you wouldn't think about that. I listen to everything. I watch everything on DVDs. And then somebody was telling me the other day from the library collection, they say, well, what are these DVDs doing on the library shelf? Nobody has DVDs anymore. Well, sure they do, because everybody doesn't. So now we got this invisible class system built into that's readily apparent when you just take a look at it of who has what and what they can do. But there are interviews. There was an interview with McLuhan that was retrieved by a media specialist who had to go through a multi-step process because of how it was recorded and what medium it was stored on. So it was not accessible to anybody. So now we're getting into the archaeological, in a sense, metaphorically. Oh, I found the Rosetta Stone. What does it mean?
Yeah.
And we got to figure out that. So there's language, computer language, coding language, our own language. And how do we choose to save what we're saying? Or do we decide we don't want to save it at all? Or do we just accept that it's always out there. We've done it on the web. Yes, but it's not equally accessible to everybody.
Yeah, obsolescence is a huge but relatively invisible part.
Ethical problem.
Yes, and I've had 2 experiences with it just this week, right? One was my father-in-law. His grandmother died when he was 2, and didn't have any real memories of her or anything. And they were cleaning out a family member's house at one point. They found a bunch of these tape reels that they couldn't play. But they figured out there might be something important on them, so they sent them out to a media company that then put them on a flash drive, and they had video footage of his grandmother playing with them as a child, right? And so now here's this experience that he has access to that he would not have been able to have access to in any other way, because there are no players for this film left other than in the hands of people who you have to send them to, and they would charge a service to send them back, right? And I'm sure that the equipment that they're using is no longer in production. You cannot get parts for it. At some point, it will cease to function. And then anybody who has tapes will be lost, right? Another one was we were cleaning out the storeroom for a media company that I'm helping to try to resurrect. And just looking through all of the old obsolete equipment, and all of the things. And okay, well, here's this piece. Maybe this will have something important on it. Oh, there's no power cord. Oh, well, here's this, but there's nothing in. And then at one point, my co-worker, who's significantly younger than me, said, "Wow." And I go, "What?" She goes, "It's a floppy disk in the package." She goes, "Can you believe this?" She's like, "We could probably get a lot of money for this somewhere. It should be in a museum. It's still in the package." So yeah, obsolescence. And this affects historicity, which is something we've done a whole episode on, right?
It does.
If the only things that continue to exist are the things for which have a continued presence in the public eye, then there's a lot of significant aspects of history that will be lost forever. And there are going to be stories that don't support the mainstream narrative, but can also be true, and that presents a problematic issue for how we perceive what is true and false throughout history if we don't have access to it.
The ethics are completely foundational in this situation. The historical societies and little villages everywhere, they have neither the staff nor the funding to properly preserve much paper documentation that wears out, that gets lost. And so there's an ethical component. Do we have a duty? Is it duty ethics that we have to preserve this? Or do we let it go because nobody cares, but it really does have something that could have an effect?
Yeah, this kind of comes back to the popularity versus quality thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
There can be zero popularity, right? Nobody cares. But the quality of what is there can be extremely important and relevant to how we view the context that we're in. So, all right. So I want to ask one last question.
Okay.
So I feel bad because I think we could explore that question.
Keep going with this one.
We could explore that question much deeper. But I want to revisit something that you mentioned earlier in the show, which was how the medium itself is an essential part of how we consume entertainment. So does virtual reality fundamentally change entertainment, or is it just a new medium?
Well, all right, I'm going to do the philosophical approach and quickly. And all right, so what do we mean by fundamentally change? What do you mean by fundamentally change?
I guess we revisit that idea of rewiring our brains, right? Will humans in the future look, act, be fundamentally different due to the effects of virtual reality once it becomes a widely used medium?
Okay, when you mean it that way, then I can say in our rapid dialogue, I can say, well, I think yes, but let me pose a question. Do you ever see anybody driving down the road, moving their head back and forth, and and boom, 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 in the woofers or tweeters or whatever is built into the car? Do we see that now? Yes. Do we used to see that? No. It's a fundamental change because people are surrounding themselves with sound. Do people behave differently because of it? Do people behave differently driving while they're holding their phones? So yeah, I think there'd be a fundamental change. If it fundamental means you can't go back to something else, that's going to be dependent on who has the motivation, means, curiosity, and the bucks to buy the equipment or services to retrieve the previous thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that view, which I think was said very well, exemplifies what I was talking about earlier with artists, right? The reversibility. I like that concept. It's sort of a flexibility or a malleability or a cognitive plasticity. The ability to, after you engage with something, to still maintain the perspective you had before you engaged with the thing, in order to sort of objectively view what it was that you actually participated in. And I think that's like the really important thing of how we engage with entertainment, right? Is the ability to do that. But I think that it's so much more difficult than we assume.
Oh yeah.
Because once you have an engagement with an experience like that, whether it's a new song or a new TV show or a new medium like virtual reality, it's hard to remember what things were like before that thing existed, right? And so if you go to write a new song after hearing this song that is changed your life, is your new favorite song, it's hard to go back to write something and to think about something other than how that thing was done. You know?
It is, and then you still have to make the decision, which I know you have for the music thing, where you purposefully emulate or revisit or pick up elements of earlier musical styles and build them into a CD that you're working on, an album. The word album used to mean one thing. Now an album means something else. It has the standard meaning across, but it's different. It implies different things about the kind of medium that it's on. The ethics of entertainment, the tools, the obsolescence, that we turn politics into entertainment. I mean, that's a whole other topic, but just to point out, when you are canted toward, pushed toward, trained into thinking of something as entertainment, you lose the memory of what the issue was in the first place. And I'm going to say this as an example because it is not a partisan example. It's just an example of what's happening currently. Somebody gets shot at. An assassination attempt is made. What the person says about that afterward is anticipated to change the flow of a campaign. When people dwell on the 5 minutes of what was said and let go the rest of the things that were said and say, oh, well, there was a change. But not necessarily uniformly, because the entertainment value was the anticipation of something fresh. And so the something fresh becomes the only important point, and you can forget everything else. Or we assumed that because a violent act was enacted, that it therefore changes a person fundamentally. It could, but it doesn't. But we're trained to be entertained by figuring out how it has changed the person, not what the person might do. You see, the entertainment changes the idea of what news is or reportage.
I think that is really sort of the important underlying point, is that when you look at brain physiology, right, there's little, entertainment is closely linked to learning, right? You have a lot of the same release of neurotransmitters that takes place. And so if you're entertained by something, if it's something that's unusual, out of the ordinary, new, you pay more attention to it, and you're more likely to focus on those elements than the ones that have continued throughout. So you latch onto that, and then anything that was sort of mundane or normal before sort of ceases to exist in some ways, and the new things pop up. And the important critique of entertainment and the danger of entertainment, these things that we've revisited throughout the episode, is sort of the loss of critical perspective, right? The loss of review. If you just allow entertainment to make you pay attention to the highlights over and over again, and you don't contextualize the whole thing, then you're amused, but you're not engaging in a critical process. The entertainment is not causing you to grow. It's not causing you to become a better person. It's just pushing your neurotransmitter buttons, and that's sort of the danger of it. So I think I am really satisfied with this episode. I think that we did touch on the points that we didn't last time, and that it really worked out well. So until next time, keep pondering.